The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling tech campus as Thomas Reed stepped out of his electric car. As the founder and CEO of Horizon Technologies, he was used to being in control, to knowing what came next. But today was different. Today he was stepping into unknown territory. "Sir, your 9 o'clock meeting has been moved to tomorrow," his assistant called out, hurrying across the parking lot with a tablet in hand. "You have a clear schedule until noon." Thomas nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The email he had received last night kept playing in his thoughts. A request from the Secret Service, not a demand, but not quite an invitation either. They wanted to see him today at their downtown office. No explanation given. "I'll be out for a few hours," he told his assistant. Something came up. He slipped back into his car, the sleek vehicle humming to life. The drive to downtown gave him time to think, to wonder what they could possibly want with him. His company was at the forefront of artificial intelligence and space technology, sure, but they had always played by the rules. At least the rules as they understood them. The Secret Service office was housed in an unassuming building, the kind you'd walk past without a second glance. Thomas found a parking spot and sat for a moment, gathering himself. He was used to boardrooms and tech conferences, not government agencies with serious agents and security protocols. The lobby was quiet, all neutral colors and uncomfortable chairs. A receptionist looked up as he approached. "I'm Thomas Reed," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I was asked to come in today." The receptionist nodded as if they had been expecting him. "Please have a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." Thomas sat, his fingers drumming against his knee. Around him, people moved with purpose, badges displayed, conversations hushed. He felt out of place in his casual blazer and jeans, the uniform of tech executives everywhere. 10 minutes later, a door opened, and a woman appeared. She was tall, with short dark hair and the kind of posture that spoke of military training. "Mr. Reed," she said, not quite a question. "I'm Agent Chen. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Please follow me." Thomas followed her through a series of hallways, each requiring a key card swipe. The deeper they went, the more his curiosity grew. What could be so important, so secret, that it required this level of security? "In here, please," Agent Chen said, gesturing to a room at the end of a corridor. Thomas expected an interrogation room, stark and intimidating. Instead, he found himself in what looked like a high-tech conference room. Screens lined one wall, and around a large table sat 3 people, all in suits, all watching him with expressions he couldn't quite read. "Mr. Reed," said a man at the head of the table, standing to shake his hand. "I'm Director Wilson. Thank you for coming." Thomas shook his hand, noting the firm grip. "I have to admit I'm curious about why I'm here." Director Wilson nodded. "Please have a seat. What we're about to discuss is classified. Before we begin, I need your verbal agreement that nothing leaves this room without proper clearance." Thomas sat, his mind racing. "You have it," he said, curiosity outweighing caution. Director Wilson touched a tablet, and the screens around them came to life. Images filled them, satellite photos, data charts, and what looked like a crash site. 3 days ago, Director Wilson began, something entered our atmosphere. Not a meteor, not space debris. Something else. Thomas leaned forward. "A spacecraft?" "We believe so," Agent Chen said from where she stood by the door. "But not one of ours, and not one we can attribute to any known space program around the world." Thomas looked at the images more carefully. The object in question didn't look like any spacecraft he recognized. No clear propulsion system, no familiar design elements. It was almost organic in appearance, smooth and rounded. "Where did it land?" he asked. "That's just it," Director Wilson said, swiping to a new image. "It didn't crash. It landed, deliberately, in a remote area of New Mexico." The new image showed the object intact, sitting in what looked like a small crater. It wasn't damaged. It wasn't burning. It was just there. "Why am I here?" Thomas asked, though a suspicion was forming in his mind. Director Wilson exchanged glances with the others at the table before answering. "Your company, Horizon Technologies, has been doing classified work on decoding non-standard communication methods. Work that could be applicable here. You think it's trying to communicate?" Thomas asked, unable to hide the excitement in his voice. "We know it is," said a woman further down the table. She hadn't introduced herself, but her presence commanded respect. "We've been receiving signals since it landed. Nothing we can decode, nothing that matches any known communication pattern. She pushed a tablet toward Thomas. On it was a series of waves, patterns that pulsed and shifted. "This is coming from the object?" he asked, studying the patterns. There was something almost familiar about them, something that tickled at the edge of his understanding. "Continuously," she confirmed, "and it's changing, evolving, as if it's trying different approaches to make contact." Thomas looked up from the tablet. "You want me to try to decode it?" It wasn't a question, but Director Wilson nodded anyway. "Your team has made breakthroughs that put you years ahead of anyone else in this field. We need that expertise." Thomas sat back, mind whirling with the implications. An extraterrestrial craft attempting communication. It was beyond anything he had imagined when he'd driven to the Secret Service office that morning. "There's more," Agent Chen said, stepping forward. She nodded to Director Wilson, who swiped to another image. This one made Thomas's breath catch. The craft had opened, revealing an interior that glowed with soft blue light. And there, at what must have been an entrance, was a figure. Not human, too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at odd angles. But undeniably alive, undeniably intelligent. "It emerged 2 hours ago," Director Wilson said quietly. "It hasn't moved from that spot. But it's been sending these signals ever since." Thomas stared at the image, a mixture of awe and disbelief washing over him. "Have you tried approaching it?" "Not yet," said the unnamed woman. "We're being cautious. First contact is delicate." Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of what they were saying. This wasn't just about decoding signals. This was about first contact with an extraterrestrial intelligence, and they wanted him to be part of it. "What do you need from me?" he asked, already knowing he couldn't turn this down. "We've set up a secure facility near the landing site," Director Wilson explained. "We need you there, with whatever team members you trust completely. This is a matter of national, no, global security." Thomas thought of his team back at Horizon, the brilliant minds he'd gathered to push the boundaries of what was possible. A few of them would be perfect for this, people he trusted with his life. "When do we leave?" he asked. "Now," said Agent Chen. "A plane is waiting. We can have your team picked up and briefed while we fly." Thomas thought of his schedule, of the meetings and deadlines that had seemed so important just hours ago. How quickly priorities could shift. "I'll need to make some calls," he said. "And I'll need my research, my equipment." Director Wilson nodded. "Agent Chen will assist you with all of that." "We've prepared for this possibility." Thomas stood, suddenly eager to begin. This was why he had founded Horizon, why he had pushed the boundaries of technology. Not for profit, not for fame, but for discovery. "One more thing," Director Wilson said, his expression grave. "The public cannot know about this, not yet. The potential for panic, for misunderstanding. It's too great." Thomas understood. The world wasn't ready. Maybe it never would be. As he followed Agent Chen out of the room, his mind was already racing with possibilities, with questions, with the incredible reality of what he had just learned. Thomas Reed had walked into a Secret Service office expecting trouble. Instead, he had found the greatest discovery in human history. And now, he was about to face it head-on. The car ride to the airfield was quiet. Agent Chen focused on the road. Thomas lost in thought. The sky above was clear blue, innocent of the knowledge that Earth was no longer alone. Or perhaps it never had been. As they approached the private hangar, Thomas saw the sleek government jet waiting, engines already running. This was really happening. "Ready?" Agent Chen asked as they pulled up to the plane. Thomas looked at her, then at the plane that would take him to an alien craft and its occupant. Was anyone ever ready for something like this? "Yes," he said simply, because sometimes the most extraordinary moments called for the simplest words. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the plane, toward a future that had suddenly become infinite with possibility. Behind him, the world continued its normal day, unaware that everything was about to change. The government jet cut through the clouds as Thomas stared out the window, his mind still trying to process everything he'd learned. Beside him, Agent Chen worked quietly on a tablet, occasionally glancing his way. "We're about 30 minutes out," she finally said, breaking the silence. "Your team has been picked up. They'll meet us at the facility." Thomas nodded, grateful that he wouldn't be facing this alone. He'd chosen 3 people from Horizon: Dr. Lily Chen, his head of AI research; Alex Patel, a brilliant linguist who had helped develop their communication algorithms, and Dr. James Wilson, whose work on pattern recognition was unmatched. All people he trusted with his life and now, potentially, with the future of humanity. Have there been any changes? Thomas asked, nodding toward Agent Chen's tablet. With our visitor? No movement from the entity, she replied. But the signal patterns have intensified. More frequent, more complex. She hesitated before adding, it's as if it knows we're coming. That sent a shiver down Thomas's spine, equal parts excitement and apprehension. The plane began its descent, and Thomas caught his first glimpse of the facility. From above, it looked like a small compound in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by desert. As they got closer, he could see the security perimeter, armed guards, vehicles, a makeshift command center, all centered around a point just beyond a ridge, the craft. The visitor, everything that was about to change. They landed on a small airstrip, and as soon as Thomas stepped off the plane, he felt the heat of the New Mexico desert. A convoy of black SUVs waited nearby. Agent Chen led him to the first vehicle. Your team arrived 20 minutes ago, she said as they drove toward the compound. They've been briefed, but I must say they're still in shock. Thomas could imagine. He was still in shock himself. The SUV crested a ridge, and suddenly Thomas could see it. The craft sat in a shallow depression, its metallic surface gleaming in the sun. It was smaller than he'd expected, perhaps the size of a city bus. But its design was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Smooth, almost fluid in appearance, as if the metal itself was alive. And there, at what must have been an entrance, stood the figure from the photographs. Even from this distance, Thomas could see it was tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. It hadn't moved. The SUV pulled up to the command center, a series of connected trailers humming with activity. As Thomas stepped out, he saw his team waiting for him, their faces a mixture of disbelief and excitement. Lily was the first to approach him. Thomas, she said, her voice unusually quiet. Is this real? They showed us the images, but it's real, Thomas confirmed, glancing toward the craft. All of it. Alex stood nearby, hands in pockets, eyes wide. They want us to talk to it. To make first contact, he shook his head. No pressure, right? James joined them, his usually calm demeanor shaken. The signal patterns are unlike anything I've ever seen. But there's structure there, Thomas. It's not random. It's trying to communicate. Director Wilson emerged from the command center, now dressed in more casual attire but still carrying the same air of authority. Mr. Reed, he said with a nod, your team has been briefed. We've set up a lab for you in Trailer 3. He gestured to one of the larger structures. Everything you requested has been delivered. Now we need results. Thomas bristled slightly at the pressure but understood the urgency. We'll need to study the signals more closely, compare them to known patterns, look for any— Sir! A young technician burst out of the command center, face flushed with excitement. It's moving! All heads turned toward the craft. The figure had indeed moved, stepping fully out of the entrance. Now it stood on the desert floor, impossibly tall and thin, looking toward the compound. It's been stationary for hours, Director Wilson muttered. Why move now? Thomas had a sudden, inexplicable certainty. Because we're here, he said. All of us. The team it was waiting for. The director gave him a sharp look. That's speculation, Mr. Reed. Yes, Thomas agreed. But I'm right. He turned to his team. Let's get to work. The lab they'd been given was state-of-the-art, hastily assembled, but containing everything they needed. Monitors showed live feeds of the craft and its occupant, while others displayed the continuing stream of signals being emitted. Lily immediately sat at one of the computers, fingers flying over the keyboard. I'm running these signals through our translation matrix. It won't give us exact meanings, but it might identify patterns, rhythms, repetitions. Alex joined her, studying the waveforms. There's something almost musical about it. Like it's not just communicating information, but emotion. James was setting up their own equipment, connecting their proprietary software to the government systems. If we can establish even basic communication, yes, no, stop, come, it would be a start. Thomas moved between them, looking over shoulders, offering suggestions, his mind racing with possibilities. Outside, through the lab's windows, he could see the craft gleaming in the desert sun. The visitor stood motionless again, but somehow Thomas knew it was watching them. Waiting. Hours passed in a blur of focused work. They made progress, identifying repeating patterns, establishing probable syntax structures, but nothing that could be called true communication. The sun was beginning to set when Agent Chen entered the lab. "Director Wilson wants an update," she said. "And there's been a development." Thomas looked up from his work. "What kind of development?" "The entity has created something," she said, pulling up an image on the main screen. "About an hour ago, the image showed the visitor standing in the same spot, but now next to it was what appeared to be a small structure. A perfect cube, about 3 feet on each side, made of the same metallic material as the craft. What is it?" Lily asked, moving closer to the screen. "We don't know," Agent Chen admitted. "It just appeared. The entity seemed to form it somehow. From nothing." Thomas studied the image. "Not from nothing," he corrected. "Matter can't be created from nothing. It must have transformed existing material. Sand, perhaps, or air molecules, and that's impossible," James said quietly. "Apparently not," Thomas replied. "Not for them." He turned to Agent Chen. "I want to go out there." The room fell silent. Agent Chen's expression hardened. "Absolutely not. We have no idea if it's safe." "It's been here for hours with no hostile action," Thomas argued. "It's trying to communicate. And now it's built something, possibly as a gesture, a gift, who knows. But we're getting nowhere from in here." Director Wilson had entered during this exchange, his face grim. "Out of the question, Mr. Reed. The risk is unacceptable." Thomas faced him. "The risk of missing this opportunity is greater. What if it gives up? What if it leaves? This could be humanity's only chance." "Or a trap," Agent Chen pointed out. "If they wanted to harm us, they could have done it already," Thomas countered. "They have technology we can't begin to understand." That cube appeared out of nowhere. If they wanted to attack, would they really need to lure one person out? Director Wilson considered this, his expression thoughtful. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Let me approach unarmed, open hands. Universal gestures of peace. I'll take one of our communication devices. It might respond more directly to our technology up close." "It's too dangerous," Lily protested. "We don't know anything about it, its biology, its intentions." "Which is exactly why we need to try," Thomas insisted. "Look at these signals." He gestured to the screens displaying the waveforms. "They've been growing more complex since we arrived. It's making an effort. We need to meet it halfway." A tense silence filled the lab. Thomas could see the conflict on everyone's faces, the desire for knowledge warring with fear of the unknown. "I'll take full responsibility," Thomas said quietly. "But we need to do this." Director Wilson stared at him for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "Dawn," he said finally. "If there's no change by dawn, we'll consider a direct approach. Until then, keep working on those signals." It wasn't the answer Thomas wanted, but it was something. He nodded, turning back to his team. "Then we have until dawn to make a breakthrough from here." They worked through the night, fueled by coffee and the enormity of what they were trying to accomplish. The signals continued, and they made incremental progress, identifying what might be numerical sequences, possible references to astronomical bodies. As the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky, Thomas stood at the lab window, watching the craft and its occupant, still motionless in the desert. The cube remained beside it, its purpose unknown. "Thomas." It was Alex, his voice urgent. "You need to see this." Thomas turned. On the main screen was a new signal pattern, dramatically different from the others. As he watched, it repeated exactly the same. "It's not random anymore," Alex explained. "It's the same message over and over." "And look at this," Lily added, pointing to another screen where she'd been running an analysis. "The pattern, it matches something." She pulled up another image next to it. "A DNA helix. It's mimicking the structure of human DNA," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just trying to talk to us. It's telling us it knows what we are." Thomas felt a chill run through him. "It studied us," he realized. All this time while we've been studying it, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, Thomas could see personnel running toward the command center, pointing toward the craft. "What's happening?" he demanded, turning to the monitors. The live feed showed the visitor moving again, walking slowly forward, away from the craft. And it was carrying the cube. "It's coming to us," Thomas said. He turned to his team. "This is it. This is first contact." Without waiting for permission, without thinking of the consequences, Thomas headed for the door. Behind him, he could hear protests, orders to stop, but none of it mattered. This was why he was here. Outside, the desert air was cool with the promise of morning. In the distance, the visitor approached, tall and alien against the landscape, the strange cube held in its elongated hands like an offering. Thomas began walking too, ignoring the shouts behind him, the sound of weapons being readied. This moment was too important for fear. As the gap between them narrowed, Thomas could finally see the visitor clearly. Its skin was a pale, luminescent blue, stretched over a frame that seemed too fragile for gravity. Its face, if it could be called that, had no features he recognized, only smooth planes and what might have been eyes. Dark and deep, they stopped, 20 feet apart, human and alien, separated by more than just space. The visitor raised the cube, holding it out, a gesture that needed no translation. Thomas stepped forward, hands open, heart pounding. Behind him, the world held its breath. First contact had begun. Time seemed to stand still as Thomas faced the alien visitor. Behind him, he could hear the tension. Hushed voices, the subtle clicks of weapons being readied. But here, in this moment, it was just the two of them, separated by 20 feet of desert sand and millions of years of separate evolution. The visitor still held out the cube, its long arms extended in what Thomas could only interpret as a gesture of offering. Up close, the being was even more otherworldly. Its skin had a translucent quality that seemed to shimmer with subtle patterns beneath the surface, like circuitry or flowing water. Thomas took a deep breath and stepped forward. One step, then another. Each footfall felt weighted with history. "Don't do it, Reed." Director Wilson's voice carried across the desert, tense and commanding. "That's far enough." Thomas paused, looking back at the assembled team. Director Wilson stood at the front, flanked by armed agents. Behind them, Thomas could see his own team watching with expressions of fear and wonder. Lily had her hands pressed to her mouth. Alex was recording everything on a tablet. James simply stared, his scientific curiosity overriding his fear. Thomas turned back to the visitor. "I have to," he called over his shoulder. Then, more quietly, to the being before him, "I'm coming closer." He continued forward until just 5 feet separated them. The alien was tall, at least 8 feet, making Thomas need to look up. He could see now that what he'd taken for eyes were indeed some kind of sensory organs, deep and dark, but with a subtle iridescence that caught the morning light. The cube between them glowed with a soft blue light, the same color as the visitor's skin. Up close, Thomas could see it wasn't actually solid. The surface seemed to shift and flow, like liquid metal held in an impossible shape. Thomas slowly raised his hands, palms up, mimicking the visitor's offering pose. The being tilted what passed for its head, a gesture so human-like that Thomas felt a surge of hope. It understood. With careful deliberation, the visitor extended its arms further, bringing the cube within Thomas's reach. "What do you want me to do?" Thomas whispered, knowing the words meant nothing to the being but hoping the tone might convey his question. In response, the visitor gently pushed the cube toward him. Heart pounding, Thomas reached out. His fingers hovered over the cube's surface, feeling a slight warmth radiating from it. Then, with a deep breath, he touched it. The sensation was unlike anything he'd experienced, neither solid nor liquid, but something in between, yielding slightly to his touch while maintaining its shape. And the moment his skin made contact, the cube's glow intensified. Patterns of light raced across its surface, pulsing in complex sequences. "It's responding to you," Lily's voice called out. She had moved closer, ignoring the protests of the security team. "The patterns match your neural activity. It's reading you, Thomas." The visitor stepped back, its movements fluid and graceful, watching as Thomas held the cube. The sensation was strange but not unpleasant, like holding something alive, something aware. "I think it wants me to take it," Thomas said, carefully lifting the cube from the visitor's hands. It was surprisingly light, almost weightless. As soon as the transfer was complete, the visitor made another gesture, both hands raised, palms forward, in what looked remarkably like a universal sign for stop or wait. Then it turned and walked back toward the craft with the same unhurried grace. "Is it leaving?" Director Wilson demanded, moving up beside Thomas, his hand on his sidearm. "I don't think so," Thomas replied, watching the tall figure. "I think it's giving us time." "Time for what?" Wilson asked. Thomas looked down at the cube in his hands, now pulsing with patterns that seemed to match his own heartbeat. Time to understand this. Back in the lab, the cube sat on a special platform they'd hastily constructed, surrounded by sensors and scanners. Thomas's team worked frantically, analyzing the object from every possible angle while Thomas reported everything he'd felt when touching it. "It's some kind of technology we've never seen before," James said. "Studying readings from their instruments, it doesn't register as any known material. In fact, most of our equipment can't even detect it properly. But it's not harmful," Lily added, checking radiation levels again. "No dangerous emissions, no biological contaminants." "It's a key," Alex said suddenly. He'd been unusually quiet, watching the cube's shifting patterns with intense concentration. Or maybe a lock. "Either way, it's meant to be opened." All eyes turned to him. "What makes you say that?" Thomas asked. Alex pointed to a series of recurring patterns on the cube's surface. "These sequences here, they're repeating but with subtle variations. Like a combination lock cycling through possible combinations. Looking for the right one," Thomas realized. "Exactly," Alex nodded. "And I think it's calibrating itself to you specifically, Thomas. The patterns changed the moment you touched it." Director Wilson, who had been observing silently from the corner, stepped forward. "So what exactly are you saying? This alien gave Reed some kind of lock to open? What's inside? Is it a weapon? If they wanted to attack us, they wouldn't need to trick us." Thomas repeated his earlier argument. "Whatever this is, it's not a threat. It's communication. How can you be so sure?" Wilson demanded. Thomas looked at the cube, its surface rippling with light patterns that somehow felt familiar. "Because I can feel it," he said quietly. "When I touch it, it's like it's trying to reach my thoughts." Before Wilson could respond, one of his agents burst into the lab. "Sir, the visitor is moving again. And the craft. It's changing." They rushed outside to see the alien standing once more at the entrance to its craft. But the craft itself was indeed transforming. Parts of its smooth surface were shifting, opening, revealing an interior bathed in the same soft blue light as the cube. "It's inviting us in," Thomas said, the realization hitting him with absolute certainty. "Absolutely not," Director Wilson stated flatly. "No one is entering that craft." Thomas looked down at the cube in his hands, then back at the visitor and the open doorway. "I don't think we have a choice. This cube, it's not just a gift. It's a test. To see if we're ready." "Ready for what?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but I think we need to find out." An hour of heated debate followed. Director Wilson called in his superiors, all the way up to the Secretary of Defense. Thomas argued his case passionately, that this was a peaceful contact, that the cube was somehow attuned to him specifically, that refusing the invitation might close the door on humanity's greatest opportunity. In the end, a compromise was reached. Thomas would approach the craft with the cube, but not enter. Not yet. He would be wired with every monitoring device available, with armed teams ready to extract him at the first sign of danger. As the sun reached its zenith, Thomas once again stood before the visitor. This time he carried the cube, which pulsed with increasingly complex patterns the closer he got to the craft. "Hello again," he said to the tall figure, knowing the words themselves meant nothing but hoping his tone conveyed his intentions. "I've brought your gift back." The visitor made no sound. It hadn't made any audible noise since its arrival, but it raised one long-fingered hand and pointed first to Thomas, then to the cube, then to the open doorway of the craft. "You want me to bring it inside?" Thomas said, nodding slowly. "I understand." He turned back toward the compound, giving a thumbs up to indicate he was proceeding. He could see his team watching anxiously through binoculars. Lily had tears in her eyes. James and Alex stood rigidly, hands clasped as if in prayer. They all understood the gravity of this moment. Thomas faced the visitor again. "Let's do this," he said, stepping forward. The alien turned and led the way into the craft. The entrance was taller than it needed to be for humans, but perfectly sized for the visitor's height. As Thomas crossed the threshold, he felt a strange sensation, like walking through a curtain of energy. A slight resistance that gave way. Inside, the craft was a single chamber, larger than it had appeared from outside. The walls curved organically, lined with panels of shifting light and unfamiliar symbols. At the center stood a pedestal that seemed made of the same material as the cube. The visitor gestured to the pedestal, then to the cube in Thomas's hands. "You want me to put it there?" Thomas said, moving forward cautiously. His monitoring devices were likely going crazy back at the lab, but he felt no danger, only a profound sense of being exactly where he needed to be. As he placed the cube on the pedestal, it seemed to meld with the surface, the two materials flowing together. Immediately, the entire chamber lit up with cascading patterns of light, symbols racing across every surface. The visitor raised both hands, and suddenly, the air in the center of the chamber shimmered. A three-dimensional projection appeared, a perfect representation of Earth, rotating slowly, glowing blue and green and white. Then, as Thomas watched in awe, the projection changed. The Earth remained, but around it appeared hundreds, thousands of tiny lights moving, traveling, connecting Earth to distant points that Thomas suddenly understood were other star systems. "A network," he breathed. "You're showing me a network." The visitor stepped closer to the projection and raised one long finger to touch a particular cluster of lights. The projection zoomed in, showing a solar system unlike Earth's. 2 suns orbited by multiple planets. On one of these planets, the visitor placed its hand and Thomas understood. "That's your home," he said. "And these," he gestured to the myriad connecting lines, "these are pathways, travel routes." He looked up at the visitor, a new understanding dawning. "You're not just making first contact. You're inviting us to join something bigger." The visitor's head tilted in what Thomas could only interpret as affirmation. Then it touched the cube again and the projection changed once more. Now it showed Earth, but Earth as Thomas had never seen it, with shimmering networks of light connecting cities, with ships unlike any human craft rising into orbit, with a transformed planet that somehow looked both more advanced and more pristine. "You're offering to help us," Thomas said, the realization filling him with wonder and hope. "To join whatever civilization you represent." The visitor extended one long hand toward Thomas, palm up, a gesture unmistakably like an offer, an invitation, a question. Thomas looked at the hand, then back at the projection of a transformed Earth. The biggest decision in human history now rested with him. Outside, the world waited, unaware that everything was about to change. Thomas stared at the alien's outstretched hand, feeling the weight of history on his shoulders. In this moment, he wasn't just Thomas Reed, CEO of Horizon Technologies. He was humanity's representative, facing a decision that would alter the course of civilization forever. "I can't make this choice alone," he said finally, looking up at the visitor. "I'm just one person. This decision belongs to all of us." The visitor tilted its head, seeming to consider Thomas's words. Then it lowered its hand and touched the pedestal again. The projection changed, showing Earth once more, but this time with a single bright point of light pulsing in what Thomas recognized as their current location. "You understand?" Thomas said, relief washing over him. "This has to be a collective decision." The visitor made a gesture, both hands spreading wide, then coming together, that somehow conveyed understanding. Then it pointed to Thomas's ear, where a small communication device had been placed before he entered the craft. Thomas touched the device. "Can you hear me?" he asked, knowing his team would be listening anxiously. "We're here, Thomas." It was Lily's voice, tense with worry. "What's happening?" "The readings we're getting are incredible. I need you all in here," Thomas said. "Director Wilson, my team, you need to see this yourselves. The visitor is offering us something beyond anything we could have imagined." A long pause followed. Thomas could imagine the chaos his request had likely caused. Finally, Director Wilson's voice came through. "Reed, we can't authorize that. The risk is—" "There is no risk," Thomas interrupted. "If I'm not in danger, and I'm clearly not, then neither will you be. Director, what I'm seeing in here, it changes everything. And I need witnesses. I need experts who can understand what's being offered." Another long pause. Thomas looked at the visitor, who stood motionless, patient. How many worlds had it visited? How many civilizations had it extended this same offer to? "2 people, Wilson finally said, "not including yourself. And we pull out at the first sign of trouble." "Understood," Thomas replied. "Lily and Alex. They'll understand the significance best." 20 minutes later, after much debate and preparation, Lily and Alex stood at the entrance to the craft. Their faces masks of nervous anticipation. Thomas met them there, the same mix of wonder and disbelief in his eyes that he'd felt upon first entering. It's safe, he assured them. And it's beyond words. You need to see it. The three of them entered together, Lily gasping audibly as she passed through that strange energy field at the entrance. Alex simply went silent, his eyes widening as he took in the organic architecture and flowing lights of the craft's interior. The visitor acknowledged them with a slight bow, then touched the pedestal once more. The projection of Earth reappeared along with the vast network connecting it to countless other worlds. "Oh my God," Lily whispered. "It's a map." "Not just a map," Thomas corrected gently. "An invitation." He quickly explained what he believed the visitor was offering: membership in some kind of interstellar community, access to technology and knowledge far beyond human understanding. Alex moved closer to the projection, studying it with a scientist's precision. "These pathways between systems, they're not random. They follow some kind of pattern." He looked at the visitor. "Are these travel routes? Like a cosmic highway system?" The visitor made a gesture of affirmation, then expanded the projection. Now they could see ships, or what they assumed were ships, traveling along these pathways, moving between stars in what seemed like impossibly short time frames. "Faster than light travel," Lily breathed. "They've solved it." The visitor touched the cube again and new images appeared, technology beyond their comprehension, but shown in a way they could begin to understand. Energy systems that seemed to draw power from space itself, medical technology that could heal almost any injury or illness, environmental systems that could cleanse pollutants from air and water. "They're showing us what we could have," Thomas said quietly, "what Earth could become." But the visitor wasn't finished. The projection changed again, this time showing Earth as it currently was, with its pollution, its conflicts, its struggling ecosystems. Then slowly, troubling images began to appear. Rising sea levels, extreme weather events, mass migrations, resource wars. "A planet in crisis, they know," Alex said, his voice hollow. "They've been watching us. They know where we're headed." The projection shifted once more, showing two diverging paths for Earth. One led to devastation, a world torn by conflict and environmental collapse. The other showed the vision they'd seen earlier, a healed planet part of the vast interstellar network. "A choice," Thomas said. "They're giving us a choice." Lily turned to the visitor. "Why us? Why now?" The visitor touched the cube again. The projection zoomed out to show Earth's solar system, then the nearby stars, then the entire Milky Way galaxy. A tiny portion of the galaxy was highlighted, a region that included Earth and perhaps 100 nearby star systems. This region was surrounded by a faint, pulsing boundary, a sector, Alex realized. "We're in their territory." "Jurisdiction?" The visitor pointed to the boundary, then made a gesture that seemed to indicate expansion. The boundary grew slightly in the projection. "They're expanding," Thomas said. "Their network is growing, and we're next on their list." "Or we're at a tipping point," Lily suggested. "Maybe they only approach civilizations when they reach a certain level of technology, or when they're at risk of self-destruction." The three humans exchanged glances, all thinking the same thing. Earth was arguably at both points, advancing technologically while simultaneously threatening its own existence. The visitor made another gesture, and the projection disappeared. It then approached a wall of the craft, touching a panel. A section of the wall became transparent, revealing the outside world. The desert, the facility, the anxious faces watching the craft. "They want us to decide," Thomas said. "Not just us three, but all of us. Humanity as a whole, but how?" Alex asked. "How do we present this to the world without causing panic? How do we get nations that can't agree on trade policies to agree on joining an alien federation?" The visitor touched the cube once more. A small section detached itself, a perfect miniature cube, glowing with the same blue light. The visitor held it out to Thomas. A piece of the technology, Thomas realized, taking the small cube carefully. "Proof." Lily looked at the visitor with new understanding. "You're giving us time. You'll wait while we decide." The visitor made an affirmative gesture, then pointed to the miniature cube in Thomas's hand, then to his head. "I think it wants you to use the cube somehow," Alex said. "Maybe to communicate? To show others?" Thomas looked down at the small cube. It pulsed in sync with his heartbeat just as the larger one had. "I think you're right." As they prepared to leave the craft, to return to a world that had no idea how completely everything had changed, Thomas turned back to the visitor. "How long?" he asked, knowing the being couldn't understand his words. "How long do we have to decide?" The visitor raised one hand, all fingers extended. Then it pointed to the sky, where the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. 5 days, Lily interpreted. "We have 5 days." Outside, Director Wilson and the others waited, tense and expectant. When Thomas, Lily, and Alex emerged, they were met with a barrage of questions. What had happened? What had they seen? Was it dangerous? Thomas held up the small cube, which glowed softly in his palm. "We need to get to Washington," he said, his voice steady despite the tumult inside him. "Now, we need to speak to the president." The next 24 hours passed in a blur of activity. Thomas and his team were flown directly to Washington, D.C., accompanied by Director Wilson and a security detail. The small cube remained in Thomas's possession, its glow never dimming, its surface occasionally rippling with patterns that seemed to respond to his thoughts. In a secure room beneath the White House, Thomas explained everything they had seen to the president and a hastily assembled team of advisors, military leaders and scientific experts. The skepticism was palpable at first, until Thomas demonstrated what the miniature cube could do. When he concentrated on the memory of the projection he'd seen in the craft, the cube projected it into the air before them, smaller than in the craft but just as clear, just as detailed. The gasps around the table told him everything he needed to know. They believed. 5 days, the president said finally after hours of questions and debate. 5 days to decide the future of humanity. She looked around the table. How do we even begin to approach this? The United Nations? A public announcement? Whatever we do, Thomas said, we need to do it quickly, and we need to present a united front. This isn't about politics or national interests. This is about the survival and advancement of our entire species. And if we say no, asked the Secretary of Defense, who had been notably quiet until now, what happens if we decline this invitation? Thomas exchanged glances with Lily and Alex. None of them had an answer. "I don't think saying no is an option," Thomas said finally. "Not given what we saw. Not given what's at stake." As dawn broke over Washington, decisions were made. The president would address the United Nations in an emergency session. Key world leaders would be briefed privately beforehand, and Thomas, with his small glowing cube, would be there to provide the proof they needed. But as he sat in his hotel room, watching the sun rise over the Capitol, Thomas felt the weight of doubt. The cube pulsed in his hand, almost like a question. Was humanity ready for this? Could we overcome our divisions, our conflicts, our short-sightedness, to embrace something so much larger than ourselves? The fate of Earth hung in the balance, and somehow Thomas Reed, who had only wanted to advance technology, who had walked into a Secret Service office just days ago expecting trouble, now held the key to humanity's future in his hands. Outside his window, a world that didn't yet know how everything was about to change went about its morning routine. In New Mexico, a visitor from the stars waited patiently for an answer, and the clock was ticking. The United Nations General Assembly had never been so full. Representatives from every nation on Earth sat in tense silence as Thomas Reed approached the podium, the small blue cube glowing in his hand. Behind him, on a hastily arranged panel, sat the President of the United States, the UN Secretary General, and a collection of the world's most respected scientists and diplomats. 3 days had passed since their return from New Mexico. 3 days of frantic diplomacy, of classified briefings, of arguments and fear and wonder. 2 days remained until the visitor expected an answer. Thomas took a deep breath, looking out at the sea of faces. Many appeared skeptical, others afraid. Some seemed angry to have been pulled into an emergency session for what they still believed was an elaborate hoax. Distinguished representatives, Thomas began, his voice steadier than he felt. I stand before you today with news that will forever change our understanding of our place in the universe. He told them everything. The craft's landing, the visitor's appearance, the communication attempts, and finally, the offer that had been extended. As he spoke, he held up the cube, which pulsed with soft blue light. I know many of you doubt my words, he said, acknowledging the skepticism he could see on many faces. I would too in your position. That's why I brought proof. Thomas concentrated on the memory of what he'd seen in the visitor's craft. The cube responded immediately, projecting a three-dimensional image into the air above the assembly. There were gasps as the delegates saw Earth, surrounded by the vast network of interstellar connections. Thomas guided them through everything the visitor had shown: the advanced technology, the two possible futures for Earth, the 5-day deadline. When the projection faded, the assembly erupted. Hundreds of voices speaking dozens of languages, all demanding answers, explanations, reassurances. The Secretary General called for order, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "We understand your concerns," the Secretary General said, when a semblance of quiet returned. "But we must approach this with clarity and unity. The fate of our planet, of our species, may depend on it." The debate that followed lasted well into the night. Some nations immediately embraced the opportunity. Smaller countries that saw advantages in a new world order. Nations on the front lines of climate change that desperately needed the advanced environmental technology the visitor offered. Others were deeply suspicious, seeing threats to sovereignty, to religious beliefs, to the fundamental nature of human civilization. The largest powers were divided even within themselves. Military leaders warned of potential threats, of deception, of conquest disguised as assistance. Scientists argued passionately for acceptance, for the quantum leap in knowledge that such contact represented. Political leaders calculated advantages, weighed risks, considered legacies. Through it all, Thomas and his team, Lily, Alex, and James, who had joined them in New York, answered questions, explained details, repeatedly demonstrated the cube's capabilities. The strain showed on their faces as the hours stretched on. "We're running out of time," Thomas said quietly to the president during a brief break. "We have less than 48 hours left." She nodded, the weight of the situation evident in the lines of her face. "The Security Council is meeting in an hour. The major powers need to find common ground. And if they can't?" Thomas asked. She had no answer. The Security Council session was closed to Thomas and his team, but they waited outside, too wired with anxiety to rest. When the doors finally opened after 6 hours of debate, the president emerged, her expression unreadable. "They've reached a preliminary agreement," she told Thomas. "Conditional acceptance of the offer, with safeguards and staged implementation. But China and Russia have concerns. They want direct evidence. They want their own representatives to meet the visitor." Thomas checked his watch. "We're down to 36 hours. There's no time for delays." "Then we make time," she replied. "We're arranging transport now. Representatives from the Security Council nations will accompany us back to New Mexico." The flight back was tense. The military transport plane filled with diplomats, scientists, and security personnel from a dozen nations. Thomas sat with his team, the cube cradled in his hands, its glow seeming to pulse with greater urgency as they drew closer to New Mexico. "What if they can't agree?" Lily asked quietly, voicing the fear they all shared. "What if we miss the deadline? Then we might lose the greatest opportunity humanity has ever been offered," Thomas replied. "And possibly doom our planet in the process." At the facility, they found a transformed scene. What had been a hastily assembled command center was now a full military installation, with representatives from global powers setting up their own observation posts, their own communications equipment, their own security perimeters. The visitor and its craft remained exactly where they had been, seemingly untroubled by the human activity surrounding them. A hastily constructed conference center had been set up, where the Security Council members and their advisors gathered. Thomas addressed them, answering questions, explaining once more what they had seen and learned. The cube projected the images again, more vivid than ever. "We need to formulate our response," the UN Secretary General said finally, "and we need to designate someone to deliver it." All eyes turned to Thomas. "I'll do it," he said simply. "But I need to know what our answer is." The final debate was surprisingly brief. Perhaps it was the proximity of the craft, the reality of seeing it with their own eyes. Perhaps it was the undeniable evidence of the cube's technology. Or perhaps, as Thomas wanted to believe, it was the recognition that some opportunities transcend politics, transcend national interests, transcend fear itself. "We accept," the Secretary General announced, after a unanimous vote that surprised even the most optimistic observers. "With conditions, with caution, with a request for patience as we adapt, but we accept." As dawn broke on the 5th day, Thomas once again approached the visitor's craft, this time accompanied by a small delegation representing Earth's major regions and powers. The cube in his hand glowed brighter than ever, almost eager. The visitor emerged from the craft as they approached, its tall figure silhouetted against the rising sun. Thomas stepped forward, holding up the small cube. "We've made our decision," he said, knowing that somehow the visitor would understand. "Earth accepts your offer. We wish to join your network, to learn, to grow, to become part of something greater than ourselves." He gestured to the delegation behind him. "We are many peoples, many nations, with many differences. We ask for patience as we find our way forward together." The visitor made a gesture that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and approval. It approached Thomas and gently took the small cube from his hand. Then, to everyone's surprise, it produced another object, a slender cylinder made of the same shifting material as the cube. It offered this to Thomas with what seemed like a ceremonial gesture. "What is it?" whispered one of the delegates. Thomas accepted the cylinder, feeling a similar connection to it as he had with the cube. As he held it, the cylinder projected a new image, a detailed map of Earth, overlaid with points of light that Thomas somehow knew represented locations where the technology would be implemented. Technology to clean the air and water, to generate clean energy, to heal the damage humans had done to their planet. "It's a beginning," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "They're helping us heal Earth first before we join the stars." The visitor made another gesture, both hands raised, then spreading wide as if embracing the sky. Then it turned and walked back to its craft. The entrance sealed behind it, but the craft remained where it was. Thomas somehow understood that it would stay, the first embassy of a civilization beyond the stars. As they walked back toward the facility, the delegates already talking excitedly about next steps, implementation plans, communication strategies, Thomas found himself lagging behind, looking up at the morning sky. Somewhere up there were countless worlds, countless civilizations now connected to Earth through an unimaginable network. Lily fell into step beside him. "Everything changes now," she said quietly. Thomas nodded. "Everything already has." He looked down at the cylinder in his hand, feeling the weight of possibility it represented. "We're not alone anymore. We never were." Behind them, the visitor's craft gleamed in the morning light. No longer an alien object, but a bridge to a future brighter than humanity had dared to imagine. Thomas Reed had walked into a Secret Service office expecting trouble. Instead, he had found humanity's greatest hope, and a new chapter in Earth's history had begun.